I find that in organizations, there is a great deal of inertia to do things the way they've been done because, hey, it's gotten us this far. And I think a big part of it is the idea of how power is manifested in a lot of organizations. There's different forms of power, if you will. And I think in a lot of organizations, what I see is very often the coercive power to punish, that hierarchical, authoritarian kind of structure that's in place. And for a leader who is driving an organization based on that form of power, it is very difficult to let that go because it's seen as a loss of power. The challenge is that that power is a power that supports him or her primarily, almost exclusively in the process, and it diminishes the power of the people working for the leader. And if we can recognize, and it's almost impossible to work through this theoretically in your head, and that's one of the challenges. But if you recognize that shifting a culture in an organization isn't a loss of power, but it's a change of power. It's a power that is a distribution amongst the team and gives everybody in the organization more autonomy. And if you've read, Drive from Dan Pink, autonomy and mastery and purpose, those are the things that we need to thrive in our workplace. It moves the power, it expands the power to more people across the organization. And with that, it opens up the opportunities for everybody to be involved, to be active, and to engage and contribute in a way that you can't do when you're living in a narrow command and control, I'm driving this forklift all day, every day kind of approach. Mm-hmm. So that's the first thing. It's a huge barrier for people that have built an organization based on authoritarian power to shift. Almost impossible. And actually, a few years ago, I would have said it is impossible. But what we're seeing right now, and this is a very interesting case study that we're seeing right now over the past decade or so, is Microsoft. Microsoft started out with Bill Gates, with Steve Ballmer, very strongly command and control, driving the show, developers, all that kind of stuff. And that was, if you didn't thrive in that hierarchy, you got ate up and spit out at Microsoft. You got destroyed. I don't know how this shift occurred, but they got Satya Nadella in there. And Satya it's still in process, but we're seeing amazing things where he is actually changing the culture at Microsoft to be one of a more distributed power nature. My neighbor actually is a senior architect with Microsoft, and I've talked to him about this. And Satya Nadella, a few years ago, put out a note to his direct reports, and it was to filter down, basically said, I want you to ask everybody that works for you if they have ever been diminished in any way, whether it's cultural or technically or whatever, in this organization. And I want you to tell me what you've done about it, not only to address that issue, but to make sure that that never happens again. Mm-hmm. That is not something that would come across from Steve Ballmer or Bill Gates. That's just a total shift.
You wouldn't think so, right?
No. And there were a lot of really strong technical people at Microsoft that thrived in that command and control because they had their fiefdoms as well. And under this new regime, there's a lot of senior people that left the company because the culture was no longer a fit for them.
Yeah.
So it is possible to shift, but it's such an outlier. That's one of the big challenges, is that perception of power, and that it's manifested in this form that, again, is reinforced by our education system and all that.
Yeah.
Now, when I talk about culture in organizations, I'm generally talking to people, whether it's open enrollment or when I'm doing it in an organization where I've got a bunch of people in the room as well. I don't have the senior leadership in the room. Once in a while I do, but very often I don't. And when I talk about all these ideas that are enabling, that are ideas such as intentionally crafting an environment or a culture where you can do your best work, everybody, universally, whatever culture they come from, they go, that would be so amazing to do that. I do a quick little exercise where I get people to interview each other, kind of a appreciative inquiry kind of idea. So the interviewer simply says, tell me about a time where you were appreciated, where you felt that you really contributed strongly in an organization. Just tell me about it. And that's all you need. And people go off on it and they run with it. And we look for common themes in there. And none of those common themes have anything to do with being in a hierarchical command and control structure. They're common themes that have to do with having autonomy to be able to choose your own way of doing things, with being able to collaborate freely with others, being able to speak your mind, being open, having this notion of psychological safety, which is a kind of a inclusive phrase for a lot of things that are important in organizations. And so everybody really knows what a good environment would look like because most people have experienced it at one point or another. And really, I think one of the steps towards effective leadership is for the leader to accept that a shift in power isn't necessarily a bad thing. Actually, it's good for everybody in the organization and for the outcomes of the organizations as well. There's no bad thing about it. And that their job isn't really to tell people what to do, it's to give them the space to figure out how to do what they need to do and to be supportive rather than directive in how they are leading the organization. I think that actually makes it easier on senior leaders because, once you get to a large organization, you can't possibly have all the answers.
Yeah, no, and no, I really like that. And I would imagine that conversely, if you asked a question about describe a really bad experience where you've been marginalized or where you couldn't live up to your potential, that wouldn't come out of this more organic way of creating and sharing knowledge and working on tasks, but more from the traditional command and control type.
The first thing I do in these workshops is I get people to think about their best and worst experiences on projects.
Right. Yeah.
And get them to come up with common themes. And it's kind of disturbing that on the positive side, the best projects they've ever been on, it's very rare that they will talk about the project manager. The project manager almost always comes up on the negative side of things, micromanaging or overbearing. So the structures that we have in place that we're wedded to for how to run projects, for how to run organizations, are actually constraining our ability to be creative and innovative.